Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday, and that means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited magic. This particular edition is sponsored by Wizards of the Coast as part of the MTG Ambassador Program, and I'll be talking about Wilds of Eldraine and the mechanics and the color pairs, what we'll be doing in that new limited format in this video. And you can pre-order Wilds of Eldraine by clicking on my link in the description below. So we had the debut video earlier this week for Wilds of Eldraine, and they did something they haven't done before, I don't think, and that is that they showed us all 10 signpost uncommons up front. In other words, the 10 cards that sort of tell you what each limited archetype is going to be about. Like, we got them right away. Usually when I do this video about an upcoming limited format, I just talk about the mechanics because that's like all we know at this early stage of preview season. But this time, we're also going to be able to talk about the archetypes. So we're going to do both of those things here. Talk about what the archetypes look like, and also talk about the mechanics and how I think they'll play in the format. So let's start with the mechanics, beginning with roles. I think this is probably the most interesting mechanic in the new format because it's not exactly like anything we've seen before. So I have Living Lectern here as the card we're looking at. It is a 2-mana 0/4. You can pay 1 and sack it and draw a card, and you create a sorcerer role token attached up to one target creature you control, activate only as a sorcery. And then it says, if you control another role on it, put that one into the graveyard. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has whenever this creature attacks, scry 1. So there are a bunch of different roles. This one creates a sorcerer role, and these are token enchantments that are auras. And this is a big thing in the format. We'll see when we talk about archetypes that there are aura decks in the format. There are various things you can do with them. And overall, you know, each of these roles is very different. You know, the sorcerer role, I should have on the screen now, augments your creature, and most of them do. You can see the monster role on the bottom gives +1/+1 and trample. So depending on, you know, what kind of role is created, your creature gets generally a different buff. And importantly, a creature can only have one role attached to it. That's one thing to remember. So you can't like slap a bunch of roles on one creature. You have to get rid of one to put one on it. So, you know, you can't stack them, and that definitely makes them maybe a little less powerful than they would otherwise be. But it also adds some interesting angles to design because there are a few cards in the format that pay you off for enchantments going to the graveyard. We'll see one of them when we look at the signpost uncommons. And that's normally something that just doesn't happen that much in Limited. But in this format, you can make it happen just by putting a role on a creature that already has one. I did mention that most of them augment your creatures, but there's one called Cursed, which makes a creature have a base power and toughness of 1/1. This is also an interesting design because you can put this on your opponent's thing, right? And you know, it hurts them, but they also have the opportunity to make their own role at some point and get rid of it. So it's certainly not permanent like it kind of would be in most formats. But overall, you know, the way they've designed cards that deal with roles, they all seem like they're pretty good rate, like already, like cards that would be borderline playable, like Living Lectern being a 2-mana 0/4 that you can pay 1 and sack to draw a card. That's probably an okay card in most limited formats, but you get to do that and draw a card and make a role token. Now, you know, we always try to think about these sorts of mechanics. How close is it to a full card worth of value? Generally speaking, these are probably worth like half a card. It doesn't feel like any of them are so powerful that you're like, wow, this is insane that I get this on top of drawing a card. But it's definitely significantly better than just drawing a card. For one thing, you know, it lets you add to the board in a way by augmenting one of your creatures. And having all these different roles is interesting. You know, they all kind of do different things. Most of them grant +1/+1 and then something else. Some of them work a little differently. You know, I'm not going to go through every single one of them here. I think it's just important to note the Cursed one, which is sort of the exception to the idea that they buff your creatures, and then all of the other ones which, you know, generally do buff your creatures in one way or another. We'll talk a little bit more about these as we move through this video because it's going to come up in the archetype part of the video where we look at the 10 signpost uncommons. But suffice it to say, I think this mechanic looks really cool, and I think it opens some interesting space in games in terms of, you know, how these things will work out, especially the fact that a creature can only have one role attached to it, which creates some interesting decisions to make. So that's one of the new mechanics. Another new mechanic is Bargain. This one is on cards like Troublemaker Oof here, which it says you may sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or token as you cast this spell. This format, you can already see that this synergizes some with the aura, the token auras we just talked about, the rolls, because you can sack them for these. And that's one way you can get value out of them. You know, sometimes you'll have put it on a creature early, and it doesn't really matter now that it's a 2/2 instead of a 1/1. So giving it up when you cast Troublemaker Oof for a bonus effect is worth it, and that's how these all work. When you cast the thing, you can choose to sack an artifact, enchantment, or token, and then you get a bonus. In this case, Troublemaker Oof enters, and if it was bargain, you get to exile an artifact or enchantment. There are a lot of those in this format, and in general, I think this card, it reminds me a lot of, in Kaldheim, there was a changeling that was the same cost, but it was a 1/3, and you had to exile a card from your graveyard, but if you did that, it went after an artifact or enchantment, and that ended up being a card you like always wanted one of, and that's kind of where this is going to slot in. I mean, it's nothing broken or insane, but it's serious value. It gives you main deck hate against 2 card types that are really common in the format. I mean, if nothing else, sometimes you'll have something expendable to get rid of, and you can get rid of one of their role tokens, you know, just to go after it. So, yeah, this appears on a lot of cards. It's important to note, you know, most of the time when we see a mechanic like this, it's something that happens when the creature enters the battlefield. Like if a card says, you know, when this enters the battlefield, you can sacrifice something. If you do, X happens. In this case, it's part of casting it. So it's more like Kicker. You know, as I say, everything is Kicker, where every card with bargain has Kicker. You may sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or token. So it's part of casting it. It's not something you get to decide once it's in play, which in some ways is better because your opponent can't respond to you putting this in play by blowing up the thing you're going to sacrifice or something like that. So there are a lot of more powerful things you can do with bargain as well. There's a 1 red mana deal 2 that becomes a deal 3 plus a scry when you bargain, for example. But you know, I think the Oof is going to be a pretty nice common overall in the format because of how it looks. So that's bargain. You know, it's a new mechanic. It doesn't feel that new. We see this sort of thing all the time. Usually it's not so specific about what you can sacrifice, but this is. I should also note there's food tokens in the set, which work well with this as well. There's just a lot of expendable things in the set for bargain to, I think, work out pretty well. So the third and final mechanic, new mechanic, is Celebration. You can see it here on Gallant Pie Wielder. It's a 3-mana 2/3 with first strike. And Celebration means that if you had 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield this turn, you get some sort of bonus. In this case, the Pie Wielder gains double strike instead. So in a lot of formats, this would be really hard to make work. But this format has a number of things going on that make this easier than it might seem at first. First of all, there's food, and there are a bunch of cards that make food when they enter the battlefield. And obviously, a non-land permanent that makes food is going to get this going. Same is true of a card that creates a role token, because that means you're getting 2 permanents right away. So any card with enter the battlefield abilities that do that kind of thing will make it, give this double strike and make your other celebration cards, also get better. On top of that, like in all formats, there are creatures that make a creature token when they enter the battlefield, which will make Gallant Pie Wielder gain its double strike. And, there's just always a few cards that can make something like this work in any format, and there are more of them than normal in this format, so I think Celebration will be easier to get going than it looks, because when you first read this, like if you read it completely out of context in Limited, you'd be like, well, I'm basically never doing that. And it's not quite that bad. I will say it isn't something that's going to be automatic or even close to it. Like, I'd say if you have permanents with Celebration in play, you should probably expect them to be online like once or twice a game, and probably not more than that. So when you're evaluating these, don't look at them as like, this is going to have double strike half the time. That's probably just not true. Even in a format with this many cards that sort of work with Celebration, I can't imagine it being something that's just easy to make work. It'll be easier than it would be in most formats, but it's not going to be automatic. Then we have 2 returning mechanics, one of which is Adventures, of course. So this was around last time we went to Eldraine. We also had them in Alchemy Horizons, Baldur's Gate, and whatever the paper version of that was, Battle for Baldur's Gate, I guess. And it's a pretty cool mechanic. So card with Adventure is a creature, sort of as its base form, as you can see on Besotted Knight here, which is 3 generic and a white for a 3/3. that's a hill giant. That's basically unplayable in limited today. But it comes with an adventure called Betroth the Beast, and you can pay 1 white for a sorcery adventure. It's a subtype. And it says create a royal roll token attached to target creature you control. This token gives enchanted creature +1/+1 and ward 1. So what that means is you can pay 1 for this from your hand. It's a split card effectively. And when you do that, you exile it. And then for the remainder of the game, you can just cast Besotted Knight out of exile. So this was a really interesting mechanic last time. It was somewhat hard to evaluate because basically, especially a lot of the common ones were like 2 cards that don't seem that good on their own, and that's certainly what we have here. I mean, a roll token is nice, but as I just mentioned, it doesn't feel like a whole card. So if this was just Betroth the Beast, it wouldn't be that good. If it was just Besotted Knight, it really wouldn't be good. But you have both in a single card. And, the way this works out is pretty nice because you can, play a 2-drop on turn 2, on turn 3, play another 2-drop, and then cast this to augment the 2-drop you have in play that can already attack. And then on the next turn, you can play the Knight. And, of course, you're not getting what we would call efficiency, but, a lot of the time in Limited, card advantage is what matters more. Value is what matters more. And that's really how it panned out last time. We had a bunch of cards with mediocre combat tricks on one side and vanilla creatures on the other side that ended up being amazing in original Eldraine. And so, I think this will work out pretty well. I think this common is probably a pretty good white common. If you haven't played with adventures before, it might be hard to believe. But you get a lot here in the end for how much you spend. It's about a card and a half of value, it feels like, when you have the time to do both. I should note you don't have to do both ever. So you could just cast it as the Knight if you really need a creature. But obviously, generally speaking, you want to get maximum value, and that means you cast both halves ultimately. And it's nice that this too synergizes with the various things we've already seen. Making one of these tokens is good alongside Bargain, and works well in general with the aura and enchantment theme in the format. And this can even get Celebration going if you have the time to cast both in the same turn. So it does a bunch of stuff, checks a lot of boxes for a card that looks kind of boring at first, but it's probably going to end up being a pretty good white common. And that's going to be true of most adventures. I mean, there are some really powerful ones at higher rarities, of course, but we're talking about Limited here, and most of them are going to look sort of mediocre on both sides. But when you remember, hey, I'm getting both of these out of a single card, they're a lot better than they look. Sagas, they have this as a returning mechanic. At this point, it almost feels like this is evergreen. I think it's deciduous technically, but I feel like it shows up in 80% of sets now, right? And I don't hate it. I like Sagas a lot, and this is an enchantment-themed set, so, it makes sense. So we've got 3 blind mice here. So the way Sagas work, which you might already know this because we keep seeing them, but it's technically a returning mechanic, so I thought I would talk about it here. When a saga enters the battlefield, it enters with a lore counter on it, and you get the Chapter 1 effect. In this case, you'll get a mouse token. So then on each of your draw steps, after that, you put another lore token on this lore counter, and then you get the next chapter. In this case, that's create a token that's a copy of target creature you control. You get that the next 2 turns, and then after that, it buffs your whole board and gives it vigilance. So, this is another way to get enchantments into the graveyard, something that is, especially as we'll see in the black-white archetype, that's something you're going to want to be doing, and Sagas automatically do it, because when you reach the last chapter, they get sacrificed. A saga that makes a creature when it enters also gets Celebration going. A saga that's in its later chapters is also something nice to sacrifice sometimes to Bargain. So, this, again, synergizes well with what we've already talked about. But in general, sagas tend to deliver a bunch of value over time. What you get in the end out of this is pretty good. I mean, usually you're at least going to get 3 1/1s and then a mass buff. And sure, it takes a while, but paying 3 mana for that is a great deal. And that's kind of how sagas work. They deliver a bunch of value over several turns, and it's usually way more than your mana's worth. So those are the mechanics in the set. I think they look really interesting overall. I think all of them will play relatively well in Limited. We just have to keep in mind, I think Celebration especially, you have to keep in mind, it's not going to be active all the time. Another thing that matters for Limited is that there is a bonus sheet in this set. We've seen a lot of them lately. And they've been pretty fun. I mean, pretty much every format, going back to Strixhaven, where we had the Mystical Archive, And then more recently, when we had Retro Frame Artifacts in the Brothers War, the Multiverse Legends in, what was that one, March of the Machine. We've had, they've made formats better usually. And if you don't know what that is, a bonus sheet is where there's one card in every pack from a subset of reprints, basically. And in this case, they're all enchantments. Again, enchantment themed set makes sense. And so far the ones we've seen, as of recording this anyway, most of them honestly aren't that good in limited. Most of them seem to be reprints that they're targeting at formats like Modern and Commander and stuff, which is going to be great if you're interested in those formats. There's a chance that they've only shown us the ones that are going to get people really excited who don't play limited. But so far, some of them kind of look unplayable. There is Bitter Blossom. That's a really powerful one that they have revealed already. So that one's pretty great. But yeah, they're nice in the format. They add more replay value to the format because you see more variety of cards thanks to this subset of cards. And overall, I think it's probably a good thing for the format. It'll be interesting to see it. I mean, and it happened before where we've had a bunch of them not be great for limited. But that's probably okay as long as some of them are, and obviously something like Bitter Blossom definitely is. Let's move now to looking at the signpost uncommons. Like I said at the beginning, it's pretty cool. They showed us all of them like right away. They haven't really done that before. And it makes, speculating about the format at this early stage a lot more interesting because we know more. So let's jump into looking at those 10 signpost uncommons. Again, a signpost uncommon is a card they print at uncommon that's 2 colors that's sort of meant to guide you towards what that archetype is. For example, let's look first at Obira Dreaming Duelist. For a blue and a black, it's a 2/2 with flash and flying, and whenever another fairy enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life. Obviously, blue-black is a fairy deck. It doesn't take a lot to figure that out. It goes really well with Bitter Blossom, incidentally. If you have both of those online, that's going to be nuts. But yeah, generally speaking, for the last several formats, the signpost uncommons tend to be pretty good on average. Like, really high quality cards, one of the better cards in your deck, and that's certainly the case with Obira. A 2-mana 2/2 with flash and flying is already good, but we also know there's lots of fairies in the set, as there has been in the past on Eldraine, and blue-black is going to have access to enough fairies and other fairy payoffs that Obira is going to be doing some pretty serious work. Next, there's Black-Red, which this is probably the color pair I'm most excited about this time around. You'll see why in a minute, or I'll explain. Here we have Totentan's Swarm Piper, which for 1 generic, a black and a green is a 2/3. When it dies, when it or another non-token creature you control dies, rather, it makes a 1/1 black rat creature token with this creature can't block, and you can pay 1 generic and a black, and give an attacking rat you control death touch until end of turn. So, at first it might look like, Black-Red is a rat deck, sort of like Blue-Black is a fairy deck, right? And there is a rat sub-theme here, but as it usually is the case, Black-Red is really a sacrifice deck. This goes really well with sacrificing things, because if you sack a creature, you're going to get another one, and if you have a good sack outlet, maybe you just sack the rat, you make 2. It's nice that he can give your rat tokens when they're attacking death touch too. I mean, it makes them a pain to block, but overall it's the rat thing that has me the most interested here. And there are other cards, several other cards in the set that do things with rats that work well with Totentans, even if you're not sacrificing them. But I think the rats overall are going to be really good sacrifice fodder. I mean, a 1/1 token that can't block is pretty close to being meaningless. I mean, it's not quite there, especially if you can give it death touch, but its purpose is more to be a value of value. It's kind of like the 2/2 zombies from one of the Innistrad sets that couldn't block, or they couldn't block, and when they attacked, they would die right at the end of combat. Those could chip in for some damage, just like these rats can, but the best value you got out of them was by sacrificing them. And I think that'll probably be true here, but, we have pet rats, and that's the reason I'm excited to see a rat archetype of sorts in the set. But overall, it's a sacrifice archetype. We've seen that many, many times before, but it does have this extra sort of rat angle that I think makes it a little bit different than what we've seen in the past. Next, there is Ruby Daring Tracker, the red-green signpost uncommon. She's a red and a green for a 1/2. She's got haste, and when she attacks, while you control a creature with power 4 or greater, she gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and she can tap for red or green. So there are 2 archetypes in this format that look like they're about ramp, and I think that's blue-green and red-green. We'll get to blue-green a little later. I think that's important to note because anytime there are really dedicated archetypes to ramp, like especially 2 of them, it suddenly makes things that cost like 7 or 8 mana, and we've got those at higher rarities. It makes them way more castable. Like if you think about Strixhaven, a format that had a couple different ramp decks in blue-green and red-green, or blue-red actually, it was blue-red and blue-green. Yeah, not red-green. But the fact remains there were 2 ramp archetypes in the format, and you were casting like 8 mana sorceries and stuff like that in that deck. And I think that's probably going to be true in this format. There are expensive things worth ramping into. Ruby, in addition to telling you red-green is probably a ramp deck, is also telling you having high power creatures is a good thing. And like all sort of signposty things, this isn't the only card we're going to see that cares about this. There's going to be other cards in the format that care about power 4 or greater, giving you sort of a critical mass of synergy when you're in this color pair, at least when things work out. One thing I like about her is if you play her early, she can help you more easily ramp into bigger creatures, because she's going to let you play a 4-drop on turn 3. But if you draw her late, you can just play her and attack with her right away as a 3/4 for 2, which is going to be a pretty nice addition to your board if you're in a situation where you want to be attacking with her anyway. So she's pretty nice early to help you ramp your mana, and then late she can really add a bunch of damage out of nowhere, which I like overall. Next, there's the green-white signpost uncommons for Armont the Redeemer. 3 generic green and white for a 4/4 that when it enters the battlefield, it creates a monster roll token. That's the one that gives +1/+1 and trample to the enchanted thing. And then enchanted creatures you control get +1/+1. So, this is one of these cards that just makes a monster roll when it enters. And this seems pretty powerful in general. It effectively gives +2/+2 to something the turn it enters the battlefield and trample. And that's going to be a huge effect on most board states. It's going to suddenly make one of your creatures that couldn't attack into an attacker, or make the one creature that could attack into a better attacker. And that's without even talking about other, having other monster rolls around, or rolls in general around, because, you could end up buffing your board significantly the turn you play this. I mean, we saw, for example, the adventure that gives you a monster roll for 1 mana. That's going to end up being really good value. This just seems, it's going to give you permanent value, close to permanent value up front, and then have all of this additional upside. It's another card, by the way, that triggers Celebration all on its own, which definitely matters. So yeah, this one looks like one of the better ones to me, just because it does what I think is one of the more powerful things in the set, which is the roll tokens, and then gives you a pretty big bonus on top of, a 5 mana 4/4 is not good, but when it's a 5 mana 4/4 that gives +2/+2 and trample to something, that's really good. So it ends up being a really powerful signpost. I mean, these all are, but I think this one's on the upper end, even of the ones we've seen. Black-white, and obviously green-white is about the roll tokens and auras more generally, but rolls most of all. Black-white, we've got Neva stalked by vampires or nightmares. I don't know where I got vampires from. 2 generic, a white and a black is a 2/2 legendary human noble at uncommon. It's got menace. When it enters the battlefield, you return a creature or enchantment from your graveyard to your hand. So black-white, as it often is, it cares about the graveyard, but there's an enchantment angle here because it can also get enchantments, not just creatures. And whenever an enchantment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on Neva and then scry 1. So this is what I was talking about earlier. You can monster rolls, or rolls more generally, you can only have one at a time, right? So sometimes if you have one that you can put on one of your creatures that is better than the one it already has, that's the kind of thing Neva will like, because the token will go to your graveyard. Additionally, Sagas are going to work well with her because they have an expiration date where they go away, and you can get the counter on her. And Neva up front, is pretty good. Gravedigger, an old card, 3 generic and a black, 2/2, return a creature from your graveyard to your hand when it enters the battlefield. That's always been a pretty nice limited card, and this is that with a whole bunch of other bells and whistles. It's got menace for one thing. It can grow. Now, I don't think growing it is the easiest thing in the world, even in this set, but there are ways to do it. Bargain also sacrifices enchantments, so you have ways to make Neva grow, and if you can, she's going to be really impressive, in addition to the fact that she gives you this 2-for-1 when she enters the battlefield that gives you back a creature or an enchantment. So I like her a lot too. I like the green, white, and black, white signpost, probably the best of the ones we've seen so far in terms of how powerful they can be and the kind of value they generate up front. And then they also kind of represent a serious threat if they stick around. Blue-red is next, as it often is, as pretty much always is, which, it'd be nice to see something a little different, but as it usually is, blue-red is about spells. We've got Johann, Apprentice Sorcerer, 4 mana, 2/5. I do think having 5 toughness is pretty nice. We've seen these payoff cards in a lot of recent formats. When I think of Lord of the Rings, like the blue-green payoffs were strong, but they all died to like everything. And so having one with really high toughness means there's a lot of stuff that just can't kill Johann, and I kind of like that. Additionally, he's just powerful. You look at the top card of your library anytime, and you can cast instants or sorceries from the top of your library. You can only do it once each turn, so you don't have this situation where you can just like rip through your whole deck if you get lucky. You're only going to get to do it once, but that, if your deck, you do need a pretty critical mass of spells to really get there, but if you can fairly consistently cast a card off the top of your library on your turn, that's big. I mean, it's like drawing an extra card every turn. And if they're instants, you can do it once on your turn, once on your opponent's turn, potentially. He combines well with effects that draw you cards, because, if you hit a land or a creature on top, you want to get that out of the way, so finding a way to draw a card and dig deeper is good. He does seem kind of hard. Spell decks are kind of at their best when you don't have to have like a crazy critical mass to really get there. And it kind of feels like you do here. Maybe having that many instants and sorceries, I'm talking like 10 is kind of what you need for Johann to be really good. Maybe having that many will be doable, but in some formats, the blue-red deck can fall kind of flat when it only looks at effects, that care about instants and sorceries. Like, that's a problem too. The best spell decks say non-creature spell. This one doesn't. It's instants or sorceries. But he's got a really high ceiling, and drafting a deck where you do have a critical mass of spells is going to feel pretty insane with him. Next, there's the black-green signpost uncommon, Greta Sweet Tooth Scourge. She's a 3 mana 3/3 that makes a food when she enters. That's already a card you'd probably play. And then she has 2 really nice abilities that let you do stuff with food. One of them, you can pay 1 green and sack it to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. You can only do it as a sorcery, so you don't have this like combat shenanigans that you can do where your opponent, it's a complete nightmare for your opponent to block. That's always fun for you, but it's also miserable to play against, and that's why they put activate only as a sorcery. That can be nice. You reach a point in some games where you just don't need food to gain you life anymore. You've stabilized, and finding something to do with that food to press your advantage now that you've stabilized, other than gain life with it, is pretty nice. And that's what Greta can do, either by buffing your creatures, or what I think is even better, you can pay 1 and a black and sack a food to draw a card and lose a life. Turning 1 food at a time into cards is really powerful. I like this signpost a lot too. I mean, it just gives you a really good rate up front. Like I said, 3 mana 3/3 make a food is something you always play, and then you get paid off for having all of this other food around. I mean, if you draw her late, and you don't really need the food to gain life, she's kind of a 5 mana 3/3 draw a card, lose 1 life. And that card's not amazing, but that's like one of the modes you have with her if you get her late. You can play her earlier and then sack the food later, obviously. So she looks quite good. There's lots of food in the set too. Next, there's red-white, where the signpost is Ash Party Crasher, a 2 mana 2/2 with haste and celebration. In this case, if 2 or more land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn, when Ash attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on her, and that's pretty good. Again, I don't think you're going to trigger celebration so often that, this is just going to grow every turn, but you don't need to. I mean, she's already got a really good baseline, and if you grow her a couple times, it's going to feel really good. It is interesting. I was talking about food. There's not that much of it in red-white, so triggering this by a creature that enters the battlefield and makes a food isn't that easy. I think rolls is probably going to be the way you get this one going the most, or cards that just make tokens, make 1 card that makes 2 tokens, or a creature that enters and makes a token. That's probably the way in red-white you'll trigger it the most. But I think you'll be able to trigger it often enough that having, cards with celebration, if you can, especially if you have multiple in play at a time and you can get them going like twice in the game, like that's plenty for you to have very powerful turns. Next up, there's blue-green. I mentioned earlier, like red-green. This looks like it's a ramp deck. We've got Troyon, Gutsy Explorer, a 3 mana 1/3 that can tap for a blue and a green. So it taps for 2 mana, but you can only use it to cast spells with mana value 5 or greater, or spells with X in their mana costs. You can also pay 1 blue and tap it to loot, draw a card, then discard a card. So, yeah, I mean, if you play this on turn 3 and it doesn't die, and you can play a 6-drop on turn 4, like, that's not out of the question here. Like, sure, your deck's probably not going to have that many 6-drops in it because it's limited, but if you can do that, it's going to give you a huge advantage, and some games might just kind of be over if you power into a 6-drop, especially if you are on the play and you power into a 6-drop on turn 4. Like, that is a beating. Like, your opponent's going to be in trouble. He does have really mediocre stats to balance out this, like, insane upside, but he also comes with a loot effect, which I think is quite nice. So, you know, like I was just saying, sometimes you're not going to have something to ramp into with this, right? Well, if that's the case, you can just loot until you find one. And then once you do, you can power into it with Troyan, which is really good. Looting in general pretty much always plays well, especially when it's cheap or free. And 1 blue is cheap enough because, you know, in limited, card quality is, like in any format, it's important, but being able to sort of throw away cards you don't need in the later stage of the game, which often means lands, in order to find cards that you do need, ends up really giving you an advantage over your opponent, who doesn't have as much control over what's happening. You know, they're going to get mana screwed more often than you in those situations. So there's like a really big upside here where there are going to be games where someone just plays a 6-drop on turn 4, and if they don't have removal, if your opponent doesn't have removal, they probably lose. But then even if you get this late, you can use it to loot and improve the quality of your draws. So I like him overall. And like I said earlier, it looks to me like 7 and 8 mana things probably castable consistently in this limited format if you're in blue-green or red-green. And then the last of these signpost uncommons is the blue-white one. It's Charade of Numbing Depths. This is 2 generic, a white and a blue for a 2/3. When it enters, you tap a creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. If a permanent with a stun counter would become untapped, you remove a stun counter from it instead. And whenever you tap 1 or more untapped creatures your opponents control, you draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. So this one's interesting. The others all seem to be sort of screaming about what the synergy really is, right? They're really telling you what to do. Blue-black's like, hey, play a bunch of fairies. Blue-green and red-green are like, play big ol' spells and creatures. Green-white says, play a bunch of enchantments. You know, these things are pretty obvious. This one is a little more subtle, I guess, about what it's saying, because I can't really imagine that the archetype is tap opponent's creatures. And that's kind of what you might think, but that's just not really going to be what is going on here. I think what's happening more here is that blue-white is a tempo deck, and creatures that enter and tap something, freeze things down, stun them down, I guess we should say these days. Things that do that are great in that sort of deck. Like if you played a 2-drop and a 3-drop, and they have like 1 creature in play, you play Shirai, tap it, and then attack them with your 2-drop and your 3-drop, that's huge, especially because Shirai also draws you a card. So, you know, 4 mana, 2/3, stun something, draw a card is a pretty powerful thing all on its own. But I can't imagine you're going to be triggering it that much more often than that. But when you do draw extra cards off of it, it's going to feel pretty good. But overall, I think blue-white is more of a tempo deck that will bounce and freeze things down to allow your creatures to attack through. It'll be interesting to see, but like I said, it would be a really weird archetype if the plan here is play a bunch of cards that say tap your opponent's creature, because that's just not, it's not something we've ever really seen before, and it doesn't seem like something that can really be that well supported overall. And we often see that there's usually one signpost uncommon that's sort of like good, but it's just sort of a good stuff deck, and I kind of think that's what we're seeing in blue-white. The other 9 very clearly are what they are. Blue-white is less obvious about it. So, you know, that's an early look at this new limited format. Next weekend's Needs and Notes won't happen because the set review will have already started. A quick reminder, if you didn't already know, if you become a patron or a channel member, you get access to my set review notes as they're ongoing. As I update it each day, more previews are revealed. And at the end of my set review, you'll also get access to my a spreadsheet with all of the grades from the set review. So those are some nice set review related perks you might be interested in. You can find a way to be a channel member or a patron in the description. Additionally, this video, as I said at the beginning, is sponsored by Wizards of the Coast as part of the MTG Ambassador Program. And you can pre-order Wilds of Eldraine right now by using the special link in the description. Thanks for watching.